It was a cold and rainy night in London, and Detective Sherlock Holmes was sitting in his dimly lit apartment, smoking his pipe and reading a book. Suddenly, there was a loud knock at the door. Holmes put down his book and opened the door to reveal Inspector Lestrade, who had a grave expression on his face. "Good evening, Inspector. What brings you here at this hour?" Holmes asked. "We've got a case, and I need your expertise, Holmes," Lestrade said, handing Holmes a folder. "It's a murder case, and we need to catch the killer before he strikes again." Holmes flipped through the folder, examining the evidence and the details of the crime. The victim was a wealthy businessman named Alexander Miller, who was found dead in his study. The cause of death was strangulation, and the room showed signs of a struggle. Holmes took a deep breath and said, "I'll take the case, Inspector. I'll need to visit the crime scene and speak to the witnesses." The next morning, Holmes arrived at the Miller estate, a grand mansion on the outskirts of London. As he walked through the door, he was greeted by Mrs. Miller, the victim's wife. She was sobbing and clutching a handkerchief in her hand. "Please, Mr. Holmes, find out who did this to my husband," she pleaded. "I will do my best, Mrs. Miller." "Can you tell me what happened on the night of the murder?" Holmes asked. "I was in my room, and my husband was working in his study. I heard a loud noise, and when I went to investigate, I found him lying on the floor. He was already dead," Mrs. Miller said, wiping away her tears. Holmes examined the study, looking for any clues or evidence. He noticed that the window was open, even though it was a cold and rainy night. He also found a piece of fabric under the victim's fingernails, indicating that he had fought with his attacker. Holmes then interviewed the household staff, but they all had alibis and didn't seem to know anything about the murder. The only suspicious thing he found was that the gardener, a man named John, had a fresh scratch on his face. Holmes decided to visit John at his home and ask him some questions. John was a quiet man, but Holmes noticed that he seemed nervous and evasive when he asked about the scratch on his face. "John, can you tell me where you were on the night of the murder?" Holmes asked. "I was at home, sir," John replied. "And can anyone confirm that you were there?" Holmes pressed. "No, sir. I was alone," John said, avoiding Holmes' gaze. Holmes decided to visit the local pub and see if anyone had seen John on the night of the murder. He struck up a conversation with the bartender, who told him that John had been there that night, but he had left early and seemed agitated. Holmes realized that John was the prime suspect in the case. He returned to the Miller estate and confronted John with the evidence. "John, we know that you killed Mr. Miller. You had a motive, and the evidence proves your guilt," Holmes said sternly. John broke down and confessed to the murder. He had been in debt and desperate for money, and he knew that Mr. Miller kept a large sum of cash in his study. When he saw the open window, he saw an opportunity and climbed in, but Mr. Miller caught him in the act. The two fought, and John strangled Mr. Miller in a moment of panic. Holmes handed John over to the police, and justice was served. Another case solved by the great detective, Sherlock Holmes. As he walked out of the Miller estate, he couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. He had solved another case, and justice had been served. But as he walked through the streets of London, Holmes knew that there were more cases to be solved. More mysteries to uncover, and more criminals to catch. And he was ready for whatever challenges came his way. The end.